Well, hi, everybody, whether it's the morning or the afternoon or the evening, welcome to this very short session on sharing team leadership for high engagement. It's obviously a very popular topic, so welcome wherever you are. What I'm going to do is I'll take you through a couple of slides, and there's probably not a lot of opportunity for you to contribute, but if you do have a question or a comment that you'd like to make or ask, please do so in the chat box, and I'll do my very best, of course, to deal with it. But this is a 30-minute session, so let's get underway. And I'll be sending you a copy of the slides and the recording at the end of this session, so you can look forward to that in your inbox. First of all, who am I? Because many of you probably this is your first exposure to me, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of who I am and what I do. You'll notice, of course, I write books, and I've got my 10th book out later this year. And you can see, of course, that I present in workshops, and I also do a lot of executive coaching, and I still play in the Golden Oldies rugby competition here in Brisbane, which is kind of sad at my age, but it gives me an outlet away from work. So gives you a little sense of who I am. So that's me. And what I want to do is talk about a book that I have just got published. It's just been released in the last couple of weeks, called Winning Teams, the 8 Characteristics of High-Performing Teams. And I just want to let you know I've had some wonderful endorsements from people in the world of sport and also the Queensland Police Commissioner. So they've said some very nice things about the book, which is always flattering. And what I've done in the book is I've used the All Blacks as an exemplar of team performance, and with an 83% result success rate, is probably the most successful sporting team in the world. So I thought, if you can't beat them, learn from them. There's a quote from Nick Farr-Jones, who is a former Wallaby captain who led Australia to a World Cup victory, and he also wrote a lovely endorsement for the book. But at the end of this presentation, I'll give you an opportunity, a special deal that you might be interested in pursuing. Now, in the book, I talk about the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams, and you'll notice in the graph on the right-hand side, this is my model, and you'll notice there's the 8 characteristics around the outside. And you'll notice, of course, that the arrow is pointing at shared leadership, because obviously that's one of the 8 characteristics, but not the only one. And the good news about the model is that if you are looking to improve your team, all you need to do is to work on one of these characteristics. And obviously today we're going to talk about shared leadership, but of course there are 7 others as well. So one of the objections that people may have at this stage, and I kind of anticipate this, that my team doesn't have the skill set and I find I must do all the work. Now, if you're in that position as a team leader, then obviously it's a bit of a catch-22, isn't it? You've got a situation where you can't really share the leadership, but of course you know that it's a good idea to do so, but you feel that the team don't have the sufficient skills to be able to share that leadership. So, and of course you're taking a chance, aren't you, by sharing the leadership if people's skill set isn't where it needs to be. So hopefully I can allay some of those concerns that you might have in our presentation here today. I basically want to cover 3 things today. I want to talk about my model, the one that I just showed you earlier, and just give you a little bit of an overview about the team identity model that I put together for the book. Of course, I'm going to share with you some strategies for shared leadership, you know, some of the things that you can do to improve the quality of, you know, sharing the leadership in your team. And of course, that leads to higher engagement because people have got skin in the game, and that's ultimately what it's about. And I'll also talk about the skills matrix a little later as another way of actually considering how you might share the leadership in the team. So here's the model, and you'll see that in the inner circle here, there are 3 features of team identity that are really important for a team leader. And I've called them buffering, bridging, and building. And ultimately what it means is that Buffering is making sure that unnecessary distractions from outside the team don't interfere with the good work of the team. That's part of a leader's role, because otherwise people can cannibalize your resources very easily. Bridging is the opposite. That's where you're reaching out to the stakeholders that you need in order to get your team to succeed and to do what it needs to do. And building is very much about building a culture within your team that is a high-performing culture. And ultimately, you've got 8 characteristics around the outside that basically relate to each of those features. And we've got building trust, shared leadership, and being agile as part of the buffering feature. We've got creating purpose and managing stakeholders as part of the bridging feature. And we've got improved systems, utilizing diversity and learning continuously as part of the building feature. So the good news, as I said earlier, is that you don't have to work on all 8 of those characteristics. You basically need to, if you work on one of those characteristics, it's likely to have an impact on the other characteristics in the model, because obviously they're all interrelated to some degree. Now, the bad news is, of course, if one of those characteristics is underdeveloped in your team, it's likely to impact negatively on the other characteristics. So obviously, you've got to start somewhere. Today, we're going to start with shared leadership. So what is shared leadership? I mean, obviously, when I talk about the term sharing leadership, what does it actually mean? Well, I think it's really about tapping into the full range of insights, the skills and abilities in your team. And that's ultimately what I see as shared leadership. Obviously, as a leader, you still have to make decisions. You have to make decisions where you don't consult your team members. And that's part and parcel of being a team leader. But on the other hand, there are lots of things where you can draw on the resources of your team to make a good or better quality decision. And I'd encourage you to do that. I would suggest to you, for example, that when you meet regularly with your team members, you should try and aim for 50% reporting, which is probably what you do, where people come back and talk about work in progress, and then 50% on discussion. And the discussion, of course, is where you can share the leadership in the team. So that's a nice model just to think about when you're working in a team environment. But of course, if it's all reporting, it's highly likely then that shared leadership is not going to be part of the repertoire of your team. Now, Daniel Pink, in his wonderful book, Drive, The Unsurprising Truth About Motivation, talked about 3 key things, and I think he's right. Basically, in a team, and particularly when you're talking about knowledge workers, he's saying that there are 3 basic things that you need to consider. You need to consider giving people the freedom and autonomy to make their own decisions, within reason, of course. But people who are knowledge workers don't want to be micromanaged. In other words, I guess the truth is none of us want to be micromanaged, but giving people some freedom and autonomy to make their own decisions, to use their independent judgment, and to be autonomous wherever possible is a good starting point. But also, everyone in the team needs to be very clear about the purpose of what you're trying to achieve. So purpose is extremely important. Now, if I, for example, walked up to any of your team members tomorrow and said, what's the purpose of this team? Would they be able to clarify that? Would they be able to do that easily? Would their purpose be in alignment with your purpose and perhaps the purpose of other members of the team? Does the team know why it exists? This is extremely important, and you might be aware from the model that I just showed you, it is actually one of the characteristics to create a purpose. And in another video, I'll certainly be talking about that. Now, the other thing that a person needs in a team is mastery. They need to be able to know that they're growing and developing, that they're learning the skills they need, not only to do the job they're doing at the moment, but also for future success as well. So autonomy, mastery, and purpose is a great model to think about when you're actually trying to get the very best that, in other words, high engagement from your team. And it's a good way to think about getting people engaged in teams. Now, here's a couple of things that you need to think about. How do you stimulate what I call a climate of enterprise? Now, climate of enterprise is where people show independent judgment. They back their own judgment. They make decisions without coming and running to you. And the question I've got for you is, do people play it safe, or do they show initiative? And of course, when you show initiative in a team, you're taking a risk, because if you show initiative, perhaps you might be not that happy with the initiative that's shown. Maybe the initiative doesn't actually, produce a good result. So that's an important question that people grapple with in the team, and they do it silently. They're watching you, they're wondering, and they're thinking, should I or shouldn't I back myself here? Now, often the case is that when people have got a choice between following a system, in other words, there's a specific way we do things in the team, that's one option that's open to a team member. But on the other hand, we've got the option to show initiative. Now, when those two options that are often competing before a team member, they'll often take the option of following the system. And the reason for that, of course, is that it's safer. Because if they follow the system and it doesn't work, of course, they can blame the system. So you have a situation where people can often be drawn into following systems, processes, and procedures because it's the safer of the two options. Now, so obviously, giving people license to show autonomy is extremely important. Now, the other thing is redefining the limits of decision-making power. One of the most practical things that you can do in your team is to get your team together and to get a whiteboard and draw 2 lines down the whiteboard. And so on the left-hand side, you put down, you might put a heading saying, following system, and ask people, what are all the things in the team that are required that we must follow systems such as safety and regulation and all the rest of it. Make a list there of all of those things. These are things that have to be followed by the system. Then go to the right-hand column and ask people, where is it possible for us to back ourselves and make an independent decision without having to follow a system? Now, you might find that that's a little more difficult for people to answer, but persist and perhaps make some, put some things down there that you hear from the team. Now, the middle column is the column where people can either follow the system on the one hand or show independent judgment on the other. Put those things down and talk to the team about those things. And what you're doing by doing this is you're clarifying the boundaries, or you're redefining the limits of decision making. So you can say to people quite clearly that on the right-hand side, the column where people have to show independent judgment, you can say to people, I expect that you would show independent judgment in these areas that you've put here. And in matter of fact, here are some other areas that you might want to consider showing independent judgment as well. I'm perfectly happy with what you're doing over here on the left-hand side, which is following systems. Now, the middle column is the interesting one, because that is where you're going to have the biggest issues. Because as I said earlier, people will feel comfortable following the system rather than making an independent judgment. And what you need to do there is to let people know that it's perfectly okay under certain circumstances for people to show independent judgment and not to actually default to following the system. So that's a very practical way that you can create a sense of psychological safety in your team, so that people have got a sense of what they can do in a team environment where autonomy is involved. So, of course, the other thing is to give people a sense of autonomy in the team. So how do you do that? Well, give people freedom to prioritize and complete their tasks in their own way, wherever possible, of course. Certainly there are deadlines and there are things that have to be met, and those things are non-negotiable. But certainly the worst thing you can do, of course, is to look over people's shoulder and micromanage people. So that's certainly one thing you can do. And then When you're a technical expert, this makes it a little bit more difficult because you probably know the work as well, if not better than your team members. And sometimes it's hard not to interfere. So, you know, you've got to be careful not to get involved in some of the technical work that your team does to an extent where you might be construed as interfering. So it's tough for a technically proficient leader to bite their tongue and not intervene. And sometimes that might be a risk because people might make a mistake. But the impression that you're sending people when you get involved in those tasks that they're supposed to do is very clear, at least in their mind, and that is that you want it done your way. So getting people to show autonomy means occasionally having these regular check-ins with people to make sure they're on the right track, but not to interfere. It's a fine balance between staying in touch, but not being a micromanager as such. The other thing that I find leaders do a lot of, and I think you'd probably agree with me, is that the leaders will often second guess people. So give them the freedom to make decisions. And of course, if you come straight in and say that won't work or that's been tried before or whatever, you may well be factually correct about that, but what you're doing is you're stifling their capacity to you know, back themselves. So rather than jump in and say, no, that won't work, a far better approach is to ask them some questions, play devil's advocate, and sooner or later people will come to their judgment about whether or not that is something that can work or not work. So just by asking a couple of questions around that, you can get people to sort of see that perhaps that's not the best option open to them. But telling people it's not the best option open to them sends a message that not only is that not the best option open, but also I don't want you to show any initiative. So micromanaging an employee can be interpreted in three ways. So when you actually micromanage, what it does is, unfortunately, three things. First of all, they think my boss doesn't trust me, because if he or she trusted me, they wouldn't be micromanaging. Secondly, it sends the message that my boss doesn't think I know what I'm doing. So he or she doesn't have confidence in my ability to do the job. Now that's not good, because that doesn't send a good message either. Or the other message it can send, of course, is that my boss thinks that they know best. Now, most likely, when you micromanage, you're actually creating all three impressions. One, they don't trust you, or you don't trust them. Two, you don't think they know what they're doing. And three is that you think you know best. And all three of those can be quite destructive when you're trying to share leadership in a team environment. Try to see yourself as a coach. And I think this is, you know, there's a lot of material out there now on the leader being a coach. And good coaches actually are in the business of helping others to help themselves. Coaches are not there to tell people what to do, or shouldn't be at least, but coaches are actually helping people help themselves. And a good coach will ask lots of questions and draw out of the person. Now, I know we're all busy, and you may say, well, I don't have time to do those in a pressured environment. Well, in a pressured environment, of course, you may not have the luxury to be the coach, but not everything, of course, is a pressured environment, or shouldn't be at least. The old adage about teaching people to catch a fish rather than catch the fish for them, I think is a good way to look at this. You want people to grow and develop as a team member. And the only way you can do that is to coach people rather than to tell people. So coaches are very good, as I said, at asking good questions. They encourage others to think and solve their own problems. And that, of course, is very, very important. So learn to be good at asking questions. I often say that a leader is in the business of asking questions, not answering questions. Now, the other thing you want to do, of course, is to help people grow and develop. And I guess a lot of this is about growth and development. And the research shows there's a connection between sharing knowledge and team learning. So if you want people to be engaged, you need to give them that opportunity to grow and develop as an individual and also as a team member. So the more people have overall responsibility for performance, the more they learn individually and as a team. So remember, there are two key accountabilities for a team member. One is obviously their individual accountability, but there's also their accountability as part of the team. And there's always a balance to get that right. So sharing the leadership batons builds capability, delegation, coaching, giving people a chance to have a say in meetings, making sure your meetings are dialogues rather than monologues, I think is a good starting point. So building capacity comes in the form, of course, of learning new tasks, skills, and learning from reflective practice. And what I mean by that is that when people have completed a task, sit down with them and ask them three key questions. What did you do well? Always start with the positive. What didn't go so well? Because that has to be broached. So regardless of how well the task is done, there are always things that can be done better. There are always things that didn't go well. That's why those two questions are relevant. And the third question you ask the team member is, if you had an opportunity to do that again, would you do anything differently? And if so, what? And that way you're getting the person to engage in the learning process. So I often think that debriefing people after they've completed a task is one of the most underrated things that happen in a team environment. And yet I think it's one of the most powerful things that can happen in a team environment. Now, the other thing you can do, and a training matrix has been around for quite a period of time, so it's not a new innovation, but I think it's something I'd like to revisit, because I think what you can do is think about all the tasks that have to be completed in your team. And what you can see here is an example of a training matrix in front of you. You'll notice that on the left-hand side, you've got the names of your team members. And across the top, you've got numbers 1 to 9. Now, each of those numbers represent one key competency or task in the team that you believe is open to being shared. So the idea is you wouldn't have everything in the team across the top there, because not everything in your team would be shared. So for example, if you've got an engineer in your team and only the engineer can sign off on work for legal reasons, then obviously you can't share that. But there are lots of things in a team environment that can be shared. So the first challenge for you is to work out what they are. And then the next thing is to actually create a matrix of where people's skill sets are in each of those tasks. So you can see at the legend at the bottom, if there's white spaces in there, it means that basically that person hasn't received any training in order to do that task yet. So in other words, they need to get some sort of training to do that. Now, the grey or the light grey area means that at least they've started, learning that task. So maybe you've done it or you've delegated that to someone else in your team. The darker grey means that that person is competent and basically means that they can do that task without any supervision at all. And then the black is not only can they do the task, but they're also, their skill sets are good enough and they have the communication skills to be able to train and teach other people by coaching that task. So you can delegate the coaching aspect to team members as well. And so what you've got there is a matrix, and you can see there, just as an example, you look at Joe. Joe is obviously, has had no training in 6, 7, 8, and 9, but he's competent in 5. And he is also competent and also a trainer in 2, 3, and 4. And he's only just started learning 1. So it basically means that I could say to Joe next week, Joe, could you spend a little bit of time with Bill, Harry, Sue, or Kathy next week, and perhaps get them started on, learning X task. Now that might only take 5 minutes. It's not going to be a big deal, but at least get the ball rolling. So it gives you a chance to be able to delegate various tasks to team members Ultimately, what you want is a matrix that's filled with dark grays. Once you've got a matrix filled with dark grays, it basically means that your team is multitasked. All of the members are able to complete the shared tasks in your team to a level of competence where they don't need to be supervised. That's a good thing, because now you've shared the leadership, and more importantly, you have shared the tasks. The question then might be, who evaluates where people are up to? Well, I suggest it's you as the team leader. I think you can make that decision yourself about where people's competency level is, in the interest of consistency, rather than have other people doing that. So I think that would be where the buck would stop with you. But in terms of the actual coaching, you can have your team members doing that, and you can set up the week to do that. So I'd actually make that a visual. I'd have that as some sort of a visual somewhere, either electronically or even in even on a whiteboard or something in your team environment. And that's a good way of being able to move towards a team where the team share their leadership. So give it some thought. It works extremely well. I've seen it working across a whole range of industries. As I said, it's not new, but I don't think enough team leaders use it as a really good tool for sharing the leadership. Now, a couple of things I wanted to say before I finish up. Now, you might be aware, and I know we've got a dedicated group of people that attend these every Friday. So thank you very much for the interest that you show in my work. I really appreciate it. But every Friday, I have a free webinar like the one I have today. And you're invited to that one next Friday on the 2nd of July. And I'm going to talk about the proactive paradox, why employees are so reactive. And this is, you can see there that my new book coming out in a couple of months, Breaking the Proactive Paradox, is available, or will be available in a couple of months. And I will talk about that proactive paradox. If you're interested, you just click on that link when I send you the slides this afternoon. And of course, that'll take you straight in, and you'll be where you are today in a week's time. And that'll be from 10 to 10:30. So invitation to you all, and I'll be sending other ones out this afternoon, or when I get a chance to do that as well. Now, the other thing I'd like to say before I wrap up is that if you'd like a copy of my book, Winning Teams, the 8 Characteristics of High Performing Teams, which is available now, I'm happy to give you an incentive, because if you go via the normal channels, it'll cost you about $35 inclusive of postage, but I'm offering you $25 including postage today. And if you're interested in that, just send me an email and I will send you out a coupon. And so when you go in and order your book from me, not only will I sign it for you personally, I'll also give you that discount, and you can pay online or I can invoice you, whatever works for you. So folks, we're done. That I just stopped sharing my screen. So thank you, everyone. Look forward to hearing from you, and keep your eyes peeled for the email. And thanks for the opportunity today of sharing with you a couple of my tips on shared leadership. Thank you, and I hope to see you next Friday for the next session on the proactive paradox. Thank you and goodbye. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you and goodbye.